Jack Coleman shuffled slowly toward the boarding gate, his cane tapping softly on the glossy airport tiles. His well-worn military jacket hung loosely over his frail shoulders, its faded patches telling stories of a life devoted to service. Beneath his cap, thin strands of white hair framed his deeply lined face, and his eyes, though weary, sparkled with quiet pride. Jack wasn't one for making a fuss, but this trip to Portland meant something special. It was a reunion, a rare gathering of the few surviving members of his old military unit. Jack felt it was his duty to show up. There weren't many of them left, after all. The gate agent, a young woman named Laura, glanced at Jack as he handed her his boarding pass. Her professional smile faltered for a moment before she replaced it with a stiff politeness. "Sir," she began, her tone firm but polite, "this ticket doesn't appear to be valid for this flight." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. "That can't be right. I bought it weeks ago, seat C22A, he replied, his voice calm but resolute. Laura's eyes flickered with impatience as she scanned the pass again. After a moment, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but this seat has already been assigned to another passenger. Please step aside while we sort this out." With a resigned sigh, Jack moved to the side, leaning on his cane as a steady stream of passengers passed him, boarding the plane. He'd flown before, and knew mishaps like this could happen. He wasn't one to raise his voice. Nearby, a man in his mid-30s leaned casually against a pillar, observing the scene. Dressed in a plain black hoodie and jeans, Mark Davis appeared to be just another traveler waiting for his flight. But Mark wasn't an ordinary passenger. He was the owner of Pacific Skies Airlines, the very airline Jack was trying to board. Mark often traveled anonymously to see how his employees treated customers. His sharp eyes narrowed as he watched Laura exchange hushed words with another gate agent. He caught snippets of their conversation. "It's overbooked. He'll probably just leave quietly. Better not let him on. It'll be less of a hassle." Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like to jump to conclusions, but the dismissive tone in their voices made his stomach turn. His gaze returned to Jack, who stood patiently, his cane trembling slightly under the weight of his grip. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Most of the passengers had already boarded. Some gave Jack sympathetic looks as they passed, while others barely noticed him. Finally, Laura returned, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry, but it looks like there's no seat available for you on this flight," she said flatly. Jack blinked in disbelief. "What do you mean there's no seat? I paid for my ticket. I have somewhere I need to be." Laura's tone grew dismissive. "I understand, sir, but this flight is overbooked, and we can't accommodate you. We can rebook you for tomorrow." Mark, still observing, couldn't stay quiet any longer. He stepped closer, pretending to check his phone, and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Excuse me, what seems to be the issue here?" Laura flinched, her professional mask slipping for a moment. "No issue. We're just assisting this passenger," she said quickly. "Assisting him by denying his seat?" Mark countered, raising an eyebrow. Jack glanced at Mark, surprised by the stranger's sudden involvement. "It's all right, son. I'll figure it out," Jack said, his voice steady despite the situation. Mark ignored Jack's attempt to downplay the matter. "Does he have a valid ticket?" he asked Laura directly. Laura hesitated before answering. "Yes, but—" "Then he should be allowed to board," Mark said, his tone hardening. "Overbooking is your mistake, not his." Laura flushed and stammered. I'll see what I can do." She hurried off to confer with another employee. Turning to Jack, Mark offered a small smile. "I'm Mark. Mind if I stick around to make sure they don't give you the runaround?" Jack chuckled softly. "Suit yourself, young man. I appreciate it." As the minutes ticked by, Mark struck up a conversation with Jack. He learned that Jack had served in the army during the Korean War and was on his way to a ceremony honoring his unit. Jack spoke humbly, glossing over the details of his service, but Mark could sense the weight of the experiences behind his words. Eventually, Laura returned, her expression sour. Laura returned to Jack with a tight expression, handing him a new boarding pass. "We've managed to find you a seat, sir," she said, her tone clipped. "But it's not in economy, it's in the last row, right next to the restroom." Jack's shoulders drooped slightly, but he nodded. "That'll do," he murmured, his voice resigned. Mark, however, wasn't having it. "That's not acceptable," he said firmly. "He paid for a specific seat." Laura's forced smile returned. "It's the best we can do," she replied sharply. Mark's gaze hardened. A part of him wanted to reveal his identity and call out Laura's dismissive attitude on the spot, but something held him back. There was more to this situation, and he could feel it. He wanted to see how it would unfold. Jack slowly made his way toward the plane, his steps unsteady as he navigated the aisle. Mark followed closely, his mind buzzing with unease. There was something about Jack that gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. Halfway down the aisle, Jack stumbled, and his small duffel bag slipped from his hand, spilling its contents. Mark rushed forward to help, crouching to gather Jack's belongings. That's when he saw it. The gleaming metal, old but polished. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. He picked up the metal, his hands trembling as he read the inscription. It was unmistakable. He had seen this metal before, sitting proudly on the mantelpiece of his late grandfather's home. Could it really be? Mark's mind raced as he handed the metal back to Jack, his questions multiplying. Could this quiet, unassuming veteran be the same Jack Coleman his grandfather had spoken about so many times? Mark didn't know for sure, but he was determined to find out. Mark followed Jack down the aisle, his thoughts spinning. His grandfather, Thomas Davis, had often shared stories of his time in the Korean War. He spoke of camaraderie, sacrifice, and one man in particular, who had left a lasting impression: Jack Coleman. Thomas had described Jack as a man of unwavering integrity, someone who had saved lives and made sacrifices few could comprehend. And now here was Jack, older, frailer, and being treated as an inconvenience by Mark's own airline staff. Jack settled into the cramped last-row seat near the restroom. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin as Mark stopped a few rows ahead, pretending to check his phone. His thoughts were still on the medal. It was identical to the one his grandfather had shown him, the Distinguished Service Cross. Few men earned such an honor, and even fewer wore it with the quiet humility Jack did. Mark knew he had to learn more. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the murmurs of passengers filled the cabin. Jack leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed and his hand resting on his duffel bag. Mark took a deep breath and stood, casually making his way toward the back. Pretending to stretch, he leaned toward Jack. "Mind if I sit here for a bit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Jack opened his eyes, squinting slightly before nodding. "Sure, young man, just don't mind the smell back here," he said with a wry smile, gesturing toward the restroom. Mark chuckled as he sat. "I've had worse," he replied. After a brief pause, he added, "That's an impressive medal you've got there. Distinguished Service Cross, right?" Jack's eyes widened slightly in surprise. He nodded, his fingers brushing the metal through the fabric of his bag. "Not many recognize it these days." "My grandfather had one," Mark said casually, keeping his tone light. "He used to tell me stories about the men he served with, said they were the real heroes." Jack gave a faint, knowing smile. "Your grandfather must have been one of them." Mark hesitated, then chose his next words carefully. "He talked a lot about someone named Jack Coleman, said he wouldn't be alive if it weren't for him." Jack's expression shifted. His smile faded, replaced by a mix of pride and sadness. "Thomas Davis," Jack murmured. "I remember him. A fine soldier, a good man." Mark's chest tightened. "That was my grandfather," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jack turned to look at Mark fully, his gaze sharp despite his age. "You're Thomas's grandson?" Mark nodded, overwhelmed by a wave of unexpected emotion. "He used to tell me about how you saved his life. He said he owed you everything." Jack pressed his lips into a thin line and looked down at his hands. "Your grandfather was braver than he gave himself credit for. He held our unit together when everything fell apart. We lost a lot of good men out there." Mark didn't respond immediately, letting Jack's words settle. After a moment, he asked, "Why didn't he ever tell me what you did?" Jack chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Men like your grandfather didn't dwell on the past. They didn't want their families to carry the burden. And besides," Jack added with a shrug, "what I did, it was just part of the job." Mark shook his head. "Not everyone would have done it." Jack shrugged again, his gaze distant. "Maybe, but it's not something I like to talk about much." The conversation paused as the faint buzz of the plane surrounded them. Mark sat quietly, absorbing everything. His admiration for Jack grew, but so did his determination to do something more. Jack's thoughtful exchange with Mark was cut short when Laura appeared, her smile tight and her tone sharper than before. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said to Mark, her voice clipped. Mark met her gaze calmly. "I'm fine here, thanks," he replied, not budging. Laura's jaw tightened. "It's against policy to block the aisle near the restrooms for too long." Mark raised an eyebrow. "I'm sitting in an empty seat, not blocking anything." Jack cleared his throat. "It's all right, son. Don't cause trouble on my account." Mark hesitated but nodded. "I'll be back," he said quietly, standing and giving Laura a pointed look as he made his way back to his original seat. As he sat down, Mark's mind raced. He had heard enough to confirm what he suspected. Jack Coleman was the same man his grandfather had spoken about so often. But Mark sensed there was more to Jack's story, something he wasn't saying. There were pauses in Jack's words, and a weight in his demeanor that hinted at unspoken memories. Determined to understand, Mark pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. He found a message from his operations team about a new veteran outreach initiative the airline was considering. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was one of the most honorable veterans he'd ever encountered, and his airline had treated the man like a nuisance. Leaning back in his seat, Mark's mind began to form a plan. He wasn't just going to apologize, he was going to make things right. As the plane began its descent, Mark returned to Jack's seat. Ignoring the curious glances from the flight attendants, he crouched down beside the older man. "When we land, can I buy you a cup of coffee?" Mark asked, his voice low. "There's something I'd like to share with you." Jack raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "All right, son, I suppose I've got time." Relief washed over Mark as he smiled. The rest of the passengers were busy preparing for arrival, oblivious to their quiet exchange. But Mark knew this was just the beginning. He didn't fully understand why yet, but he felt an overwhelming responsibility to Jack, not just for what he had done for Mark's grandfather, but for everything he represented. When the plane landed, Mark stayed close to Jack, ensuring he wasn't left behind in the chaos of disembarking. The terminal was bustling with noise and movement, but Mark led Jack to a quiet corner in a small cafe near the baggage claim. Jack lowered himself into a chair with deliberate care, his cane resting beside him. Mark ordered 2 coffees and returned with the steaming cups, setting one in front of Jack before taking the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jack stirred his coffee absently, his gaze lost in the swirling liquid. "I meant what I said on the plane," Mark began, leaning forward. "I want to hear more about your story. My grandfather spoke about you often, but I never really understood how much you did for him." Jack glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said simply. "He didn't need to make a fuss about me." Mark shook his head. "But you saved his life, didn't you?" Jack sighed, setting down his spoon. "We saved each other's lives, son. That's how it works in war. You don't think about yourself, you think about the man next to you. That's what your grandfather and I did." Mark frowned, sensing Jack's reluctance to delve into the details. "But there's more to it, isn't there?" he asked gently. "He always talked about one particular day, said it changed everything." Jack's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee. He took a long sip, his eyes distant, before speaking in a quieter voice. "There was a day. Yes, it was the worst day of my life." Mark didn't press, giving Jack the space to decide how much to share. Finally, after a long pause, Jack began. "It was early 1951, he said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "We were deep in enemy territory, cut off from reinforcements. The cold was unbearable and morale was low. Our unit had been tasked with holding a critical position, but it was an impossible mission. We all knew it." Mark listened intently, his coffee untouched. "Your grandfather and I were part of a small squad sent to scout ahead," Jack continued. "We stumbled into an ambush. Fire came from every direction. Half our squad was gone in the first few minutes. The rest of us scrambled for cover, but it was chaos. Your grandfather was hit in the leg and we were pinned down." Jack paused, his grip tightening on his coffee cup. "I had a choice, leave him behind and try to escape, or risk my neck to get him out. I didn't think about it. I just acted. I grabbed him and dragged him through enemy fire, one step at a time. By some miracle, we made it back to the unit." Mark's chest tightened as he imagined the scene. And that's how you earned the Distinguished Service Cross? He asked softly. Jack shook his head. No, he said quietly. That came later. Saving your grandfather was just the start. The real fight came when the enemy launched an all-out assault. We were outnumbered 10-1. I took command when our lieutenant was killed. We held the line for hours, long enough for reinforcements to arrive. That's why they gave me the medal, not for saving your grandfather, but for holding that damned hill. Mark sat in silence, overwhelmed by the gravity of Jack's story. You make it sound like it was nothing, Mark said finally. But it wasn't. You saved lives. My grandfather's life. Jack's gaze hardened. I did what I had to do. But the truth is, I've carried the weight of that day ever since. The men we lost, the things we saw. Medals don't erase any of that. Mark was quiet, letting Jack's words settle. I think my grandfather understood that, he said at last. He always said the bravest men are the ones who carry the heaviest burdens. Jack gave a faint smile. Your grandfather always did have a way with words. Mark hesitated before speaking again. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice steady but emotional. I'm not just another passenger on that flight. I own Pacific Skies Airlines. Jack's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for Mark to continue. I started the airline to honor my grandfather's memory, Mark explained. He taught me about integrity, about treating people the way they deserve to be treated. But today, Mark trailed off, shame creeping into his voice. Today, my staff failed you. I failed you. Jack waved a hand dismissively. Son, you don't need to apologize for them. It wasn't your fault. Mark leaned forward, his voice firm. No, I do need to apologize. The way you were treated was unacceptable. You deserve better, and I'm going to make sure this never happens again, to you or anyone else. Jack studied Mark for a long moment before nodding. Your grandfather would be proud of you, son. Mark's resolve hardened. This was just the beginning. He had to make it right, not just for Jack, but for every veteran who deserved the respect they had earned. Jack recounted the harrowing moment in vivid detail. The relentless enemy fire, dragging Thomas one step at a time through chaos, and the sheer miracle of making it back to their unit alive. Mark's chest tightened as he pictured the scene. And that's how you earned the Distinguished Service Cross? Jack shook his head. No, he said simply. That came later. Saving your grandfather was just the beginning. The real fight came after the enemy launched an all-out assault. We were outnumbered 10-1. When our lieutenant was killed, I took command. We held the line for hours, long enough for reinforcements to arrive. That's why they gave me the medal, not for saving Thomas, but for holding that cursed hill. Mark swallowed hard, his throat tightening. You make it sound like it was nothing. But it wasn't. You saved lives, my grandfather's life. Jack's gaze hardened. I did what I had to do. But the truth is, I've carried the weight of that day ever since. The men we lost, the things we saw, medals don't erase any of that. Mark remained silent for a moment, letting Jack's words sink in. Then he said quietly, I think my grandfather understood that. He always said the bravest men are the ones who carry the heaviest burdens. A faint smile touched Jack's lips. Thomas always had a way with words, he murmured. Mark hesitated, then leaned forward. There's something I need to tell you, he began. I wasn't just a passenger on that flight. I own Pacific Skies Airlines. Jack's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for Mark to continue. I started the airline to honor my grandfather's memory, Mark explained. He taught me about integrity, about treating people the way they deserve to be treated. And today, Mark trailed off, shame creeping into his voice. Today, I failed you. My staff failed you. Jack waved a dismissive hand. Son, you don't need to apologize for them. It wasn't your fault. But Mark shook his head, his voice firm. No, I do need to apologize. The way you were treated was unacceptable. You deserve better. I'm going to make sure this never happens again, to you or anyone else. Jack studied Mark for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your grandfather would be proud of you, he said. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, as Jack shared more stories of his time with Thomas. Mark soaked in every word, amazed at the depth of the bond the two men had shared. When Jack glanced at the clock, he frowned. I've kept you long enough, he said, rising slowly with the help of his cane. You haven't kept me at all, Mark replied, standing as well. But there's one more thing I'd like to do. Jack tilted his head curiously. "What's that?" "Wait here," Mark said with a smile. A few minutes later, Mark returned with a Pacific Skies representative in tow. The woman handed Jack a neatly folded envelope. Mark placed a hand on Jack's shoulder as he explained, "That's a lifetime pass for unlimited flights. First class, every time. It's the least I can do." Jack's eyes widened, and for a moment he was at a loss for words. Then he chuckled softly. "You don't have to do that, son." "I know," Mark replied, "but I want to. Consider it a small way to repay what you did for my grandfather and for this country." Jack stared at the envelope, then looked up to meet Mark's gaze. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. Mark smiled. "Thank you, Jack, for everything." As they shook hands, Mark felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about honoring Jack, it was about ensuring every veteran, every passenger was treated with the respect they deserved. Jack left the cafe, but the weight of their conversation lingered in Mark's mind. The bravery, sacrifice, and loss Jack had shared left an impression that wouldn't fade. As they walked toward the terminal exit, Mark couldn't help but notice the way people seemed to overlook Jack entirely. Here was a man who had risked his life for his country, carried the scars of battle, and yet was treated as if he were invisible. Mark's jaw tightened as he recalled how the flight crew had dismissed Jack, making him feel small. "Jack," Mark said, breaking the silence, "I know you probably don't like dwelling on the past, but have you ever spoken about your experiences publicly?" Jack gave a low chuckle, leaning slightly on his cane. "Not much, son. Most people don't want to hear old war stories. They've got their own problems to deal with." Mark frowned. "I think you're wrong about that. Your story matters. People need to hear it. If they understood the sacrifices veterans like you made, they'd treat you, and others like you, with the respect you deserve." Jack shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe, but respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." Mark stopped walking and turned to face Jack. "You've earned it 100 times over, and it's not just about you, it's about every veteran who's ever been overlooked or disrespected. This isn't just your story, Jack. It's a reminder of what we owe to the people who have served." Jack studied Mark for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "Dead serious," Mark replied. "And I'm going to make sure this airline becomes a leader in honoring veterans. You've inspired me to start." "It's a reminder of what we owe to the people who have served," Mark said with conviction. Jack tilted his head, studying Mark closely. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Mark nodded firmly. "Dead serious. I'm going to make sure this airline becomes a leader in honoring veterans. You've given me the inspiration to start." That evening, Mark sat in his office, poring over his ideas for change. He thought about Jack, his humility, quiet strength, and the deep pain he carried from his experiences in the war. Mark realized that Jack's memories and those of countless other veterans deserved more than acknowledgement. They deserved action. By the time he finished, Mark had drafted the framework for what he called the Sky Honor Program. It would begin with small, meaningful changes: priority boarding for veterans, complimentary upgrades to first class when available, and personalized recognition for those who showed military ID. But Mark wanted to do more. He envisioned partnerships with veterans organizations to offer discounted flights for military families and host events celebrating their contributions. Most importantly, he wanted veterans' stories, like Jack's, to be shared. Mark planned to create a platform where veterans could recount their experiences, connecting passengers to the real people behind the uniforms. He believed that if people understood the sacrifices veterans made, it would inspire a culture of respect and gratitude. A week later, Mark invited Jack back to the airport for a meeting. Jack arrived, his cane tapping softly on the polished floor, his expression skeptical as he stepped into the conference room. "What's all this about?" Jack asked, glancing at the small group of people seated around a table. Mark greeted him warmly. "Jack, these are my senior staff. I wanted them to meet you and hear your story." Jack shifted uncomfortably, looking uncertain. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," he murmured. Mark placed a reassuring hand on Jack's shoulder. "You are. Trust me." After a moment of hesitation, Jack nodded and took a seat at the head of the table. Resting his hands on his cane, he began to speak, His voice was steady, though unpolished, and his words were simple but powerful. He shared stories of the camaraderie he had felt with his unit, the sacrifices they made, and the men they lost. He spoke of the pride he felt in serving his country and the heavy guilt he carried for those who didn't make it home. By the time Jack finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the most hardened executives were visibly moved, their expressions softening with newfound respect. After the meeting, Mark pulled Jack aside. "You made an impact today," he said. "I think you're starting to see how much your story matters." Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe you're right, son. It felt good to talk about it, like I was doing something for the men who didn't make it back." "You were," Mark said, "and this is just the beginning." Mark handed Jack a folder containing the details of the Sky Honor program. As Jack read through the plans, his eyes widened. "You're really doing all this?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Mark nodded. "Because of you. Because of what you represent. I want to make sure no veteran ever feels the way you did when you were denied your seat. This program is my way of honoring you and everyone like you." Jack's hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "Thank you, Mark. This means more than I can say." Mark smiled warmly. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that your story made a difference." A week later, Pacific Skies Airlines hosted a small event to celebrate the launch of the Sky Honor program. The announcement had been kept quiet, with only a select group invited. Laura received the invitation without any context, assuming it was just another training session or policy update. When she entered the conference room, her heart sank at the sight of Jack Coleman sitting at the head of the room, his cane resting beside him. The memory of their interaction at the boarding gate flooded back, and guilt settled heavily in her chest. Quietly, she slipped into a seat near the back, hoping to avoid notice. At the front of the room stood Mark, casually dressed but radiating authority. Laura didn't recognize him as anything more than another passenger from the flight. She assumed he was an organizer or perhaps a representative from a veterans group. Mark began with a warm welcome, his tone steady but commanding. "Thank you all for being here today," he said. "We're here to honor someone whose story has inspired real change, not just in our airline, but in how we approach every passenger who walks through our doors." Laura glanced nervously at Jack, who didn't seem to notice her. His expression remained calm and unreadable. Mark's voice pulled her attention back. "Before we continue, I'd like to introduce a special guest," he said, gesturing toward Jack. "This is Mr. Jack Coleman, a decorated war veteran." Jack nodded humbly as polite applause rippled through the room. Laura clapped hesitantly, her cheeks burning with shame. She hoped Jack wouldn't recognize her, but the weight of her actions that day pressed heavily on her. Mark continued, his words carrying a mix of reverence and resolve. "Jack's story highlights the sacrifices so many veterans have made for this country. But it also highlights something else, how easy it is to overlook the people who've given so much. That's something we, as an airline, cannot allow." Mark's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Laura. She felt her breath catch as his words seemed to cut through her directly. "Sometimes our mistakes come from not knowing," Mark said. "Sometimes they come from assumptions. And sometimes they come from forgetting the responsibility we have to treat every passenger with dignity." Laura's heart pounded as she avoided eye contact, her guilt growing with each word. "And someone who embodies the values of courage, humility, and service," Mark concluded as he gestured toward Jack. Jack stood slowly, offering a small nod to the room. Polite applause rippled through the crowd, though one person's clapping was hesitant. Laura. Her cheeks burned as she joined in, guilt tightening in her chest. As Jack began to share a brief story about his service, Laura's stomach churned. She wanted to sink into her chair and disappear. She hadn't realized who Jack was that day at the gate. She hadn't cared enough to ask. But hearing his quiet yet powerful words now, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. When Jack finished speaking, Mark returned to the front of the room. His voice took on a sharper edge. "Mr. Coleman's story highlights the sacrifices so many veterans have made for this country," he said. "But it also highlights something else, how easy it is to overlook the people who have given so much. And that's something we, as an airline, cannot allow." Mark's gaze swept the room before landing on Laura. Sometimes our mistakes come from not knowing, he continued. Sometimes they come from assumptions, and sometimes they come from forgetting the responsibility we have to treat every passenger with dignity. Laura's breath caught. Was he talking about her? Mark's tone remained calm but firm as he went on. Last week, one of our staff members failed in that responsibility. They dismissed Mr. Coleman, treating him as though he didn't matter. That moment wasn't just a failure of one person. It was a failure of our values. Laura's heart pounded as Mark's eyes locked on hers. He began walking toward her, his expression steady but unyielding. "Laura," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you remember Mr. Coleman?" Her face went pale. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. Mark nodded. "And do you remember me?" Laura blinked, confused. "You were on the flight, weren't you?" "I was," Mark replied, his tone sharpening. "But I wasn't just another passenger. I'm Mark Davis. I own this airline." The room went dead silent. Laura's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her face flushed a deep red as the realization hit her. She had ignored and dismissed not just a war hero, but the airline's owner. Mark didn't let the moment linger. "You didn't know who I was. That's fine. I wasn't there to draw attention to myself. But you didn't know who Mr. Coleman was either, and that's the problem. You didn't take the time to find out. You made assumptions based on his appearance, and you treated him as though he was less important than the other passengers." Laura's voice trembled. "Mr. Davis, I didn't mean to." Mark held up a hand, cutting her off. "Intent doesn't matter, Laura. Actions do. What you did wasn't just disrespectful, it was a missed opportunity to honor someone who deserved better." Laura's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. I didn't know, I didn't realize." "That's exactly why we're here today," Mark said, his tone softening slightly. "Not to shame you, but to ensure this never happens again. This isn't just about Mr. Coleman, it's about every veteran, every passenger who deserves respect and dignity." Mark turned toward Jack. "Mr. Coleman, is there anything you'd like to say?" Jack met Laura's tearful gaze, his expression thoughtful. "We all make mistakes, young lady," he said gently. "What matters is what you do after. I don't need an apology. I need to know you've learned from this." Laura nodded quickly, tears streaming down her face. "I have. I promise I'll do better." Mark addressed the room once more. "Moving forward, every member of our staff will undergo training on how to better serve our veterans and passengers with dignity. This isn't just a policy change, it's a commitment to live up to the values we stand for." As the meeting concluded, Laura approached Jack hesitantly. "Mr. Coleman," she said softly, "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that your story has changed me. Thank you for teaching me something I'll never forget." Jack smiled warmly. "It's never too late to learn, young lady, and for what it's worth, I think you'll do just fine." Laura left the room with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to honor not only Jack, but every veteran she encountered moving forward. Mark watched her go, confident that the lesson had left a lasting impact. 2 months later, the Sky Honor program was fully implemented across Pacific Skies Airlines. Veterans now received priority boarding, complimentary upgrades when available, and personalized recognition from staff. The program had gained significant media attention, drawing praise from veterans organizations and passengers alike. But Mark knew the most important step was yet to come. That day, the airline hosted a ceremony to unveil a new addition to its fleet, a plane dedicated to Jack Coleman and the men and women who had served in the military. Mark had kept the details of the event a secret from Jack, wanting the recognition to be a surprise. Mark had kept the details of the ceremony a secret from Jack, wanting the recognition to be a heartfelt surprise. Jack arrived at the hangar, leaning on his cane as Mark greeted him with a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Jack," Mark said, shaking his hand firmly. "Good to see you too, son," Jack replied, glancing around. "But you didn't tell me what all this fuss is about." Mark chuckled. "You'll see soon enough." The hangar was buzzing with energy. Airline employees, veterans, and reporters filled the space. Laura stood near the front, her demeanor transformed. She had embraced her role as an advocate for the Sky Honor program, going above and beyond to ensure that every veteran felt valued. As the crowd quieted, Mark stepped onto a small stage set up in front of a large covered aircraft. A microphone crackled to life as he began to speak. Good afternoon, everyone, Mark said, his voice steady and confident. Today is a special day for Pacific Skies Airlines. We're not just celebrating the success of the Sky Honor program, we're celebrating the people who made it possible. He gestured toward Jack, seated in the front row. Mr. Jack Coleman is one of those people. His courage, humility, and story inspired us to create a program that ensures no veteran is ever overlooked. But words alone aren't enough to honor someone like Jack. So we decided to do something more. With a nod, Mark signaled for the cover to be removed. The crowd gasped as a massive banner fell away, revealing a gleaming aircraft. Painted on its side was a stunning mural of a soldier saluting against the backdrop of an American flag. Bold letters on the tail bore the name, Jack Coleman, a legacy of courage. Jack's eyes widened, his mouth falling open as he gripped his cane tightly. His hands trembled as he stared at the tribute. The crowd erupted into applause, and Mark stepped off the stage to kneel beside Jack. "This plane is dedicated to you and every veteran who has ever served," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every time it takes off, it will carry your legacy with it." Jack blinked rapidly, trying to process what he was seeing. Finally, he found his voice. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mark replied. "This is for you, for everything you've done." Laura approached Jack as the applause continued, her eyes shining with admiration. "Mr. Coleman," she said softly, "I just want to thank you for your service, for your patience, and for giving me a chance to grow. I'll never forget what you taught me." Jack smiled warmly, his expression kind. "You've done good, young lady. Keep it up." As the ceremony concluded, Jack stood with Mark in front of the plane, posing for photos and answering reporters' questions. Despite the attention, Jack remained humble, deflecting praise and focusing on the men he had served with. When the crowd began to disperse, Jack turned to Mark. "You didn't have to do all this, you know." "I did," Mark said firmly. "Because it's not just about you, Jack. It's about ensuring every veteran is remembered and honored. You've inspired something bigger than either of us." Jack nodded, his eyes misty. "Then I'm glad I could help." As Jack boarded the plane for its inaugural flight, a symbolic journey carrying veterans and their families, Mark watched with a sense of pride and fulfillment. The airline had transformed not just in policy, but in spirit, becoming a place where every passenger's story mattered. As the plane's engines roared to life, Jack looked out the window. The sight of his name on the tail brought a rare smile to his face. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen, not just as a veteran, but as a person whose life had made a difference. Mark turned to Laura, who stood beside him, watching the plane take off. "This is just the beginning," Mark said. Laura nodded, her voice filled with conviction. "Thanks to you and Mr. Coleman, it's a beginning we can all be proud of." The plane climbed higher into the sky, carrying not just passengers, but a legacy of courage, respect, and change. Jack Coleman's name would soar across the country, a powerful reminder that every life has a story worth honoring, and every story can inspire a world of difference.